Welcome Dr. Pradeep Gokhale and Professor Bahulkar, the Honorary Secretary of the Institute. On this 93rd death anniversary of Sir Ramkrishna Gopal Bhandarkar, falling on Roshi Panchami, I welcome you all and I request the Honorary Secretary, Professor Bahulkar, to introduce Dr. Gokhale and also felicitate him.
Friends, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all and Professor Pradeep Gokhale on the occasion of the 93rd death anniversary of Sir Gopal Ramkrishna Gopal Bhandarkar. As we all are aware, R.J. Bhandarkar was one of the pioneering Indologists who has done research in the number of fields. And we know that this institute was founded on the occasion of his 80th birthday as a birthday present given to him by his friends, colleagues and students. Since then, this institute has been working particularly in the field of Indology and has published a number of books. Two of them should be mentioned. The first critical edition of the Mahabharata and Mahamopadhyay Pandurang Vaman Kane's History of Dharma Shastra. Sir Bhandarkar, as a scholar, he was very popular. At the same time, he was a social worker. He was closely associated with Prarthana Samaj. And he was the president of the first session of All India Oriental Conference, which was established by this institute, and the first session of which was held in Pune, organized by this institute. I think I need not spend much time in introducing or speaking about Ramkrishna Gopal Bhandarkar. Today's speaker, Professor Gokhale, he has retired in January 2012 as a professor from the Department of Philosophy, Savitribai Phule Pune University. And he has also worked in Sarnath, in the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Research Professor. He worked there from 2012 to 2017 for last 6 years. And now he has returned to Pune, and recently he has been appointed by the Vice Chancellor of Pune University as adjunct professor at the Department of Philosophy and also Department of Pali of that university. Professor Gokhale, as I know him for the last more than 50 years, is basically a Sanskrit scholar. We have been close friends, rather colleagues. We were students at the Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapit, where he studied Sanskrit, and he studied philosophical texts, grammar and other subjects with our teacher Pandit V.B. Bhagavat, who was a great teacher, great scholar and a rare kind of personality. Professor Gokhale, he knows Sanskrit so well that he can compose poems in Sanskrit very easily. He has to his credit a number of Sanskrit poems, also Marathi poems. He is a poet. He has published anthologies of his poems in Marathi, Prem, Maran and Shantata, and a recent publication, Odi. I am one of the first readers of those poems. As a scholar, he has worked in the field of philosophy and particularly in recent years in Buddhist philosophy, and also has studied the works of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. He has written a number of books in English, Inference and Fallacies discussed in Ancient Indian Logic with special reference to Nyaya and Buddhism. It is his PhD dissertation done under the supervision of great scholar Professor Barlinge. Then Vadanyaya, he translated two works of Dharmakirti, Vadanyaya and Hetubindu. Recollection, Recognition and Reasoning, a study in the Jaina theory of Paroksha Pramana, written in collaboration with S.S. Antarkar and Meenal Katarnikar, published in 2011. Then Lokayata and Charvaka, a philosophical inquiry, published from Oxford University Press. And he has also some Marathi books, Vishamatecha Puraskarta Manu, published in 1983. He has collected some passages from Manusmriti that clearly show how Manu has tried to justify Vishamata, discrimination based on caste. And when I saw the book, I said that, okay, this is a very good book. In Marathi, I said that, तुम्ही एक मनुस्मृतीची दहन योग्य प्रत तयार केलेली आहे. He is fond of Charvaka and the Buddha. He has given lecture on Charvaka and Advaitavada. Then Jnanadevanचे अनुभवामृतातील तत्वज्ञान. I was surprised to see that he has also worked on Jnaneshwara and connected with Vedanta. Then Vichara Sanjeevani, elixir of thoughts, thoughts conducive to good life. And Comrade Sharad Patil यांचे वैचारिक योगदान आणि आंबेडकर वाद. Tattvachintak Charvak. This is a recent publication. And a number of works, more than 40 excellent research papers. So we are very happy to have him here, and he is going to speak on Karma doctrine, some critical observations. I welcome him. With a bouquet of flowers, the token of our love. And without taking much of your time, I request him to begin his lecture.
Yeah, some formality.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Important formality.
Important formality.
Friends, this is a day when we announce our new publications, and this time there is a good number I think you will appreciate. I request Professor Gokhale to open that shawl and please release those publications. We don't like our guest to take the incarnation of Narasimha and tear off the packets, etc. So we always do it in this manner. So the first thing is the book Sharanagati by Dr. G.K. Pai. Sharanagati as reflected in the major Puranas. It has got 248 pages altogether. The second one are three fascicules of a comprehensive and critical dictionary of the Prakrit language with special reference to Jain literature, volume 6, fascicules 2, 3 and 4. Volume 6, fascicules 2, 3 and 4, altogether comprising 480 pages. Then the next thing is 95th volume of the Annals of the Bhandarkar Institute. It has got 176 pages. And I'm very happy to tell you that during the last year, we have brought out altogether 3 volumes of the Annals. Then there are some publications which are in reprints, and they are of course, there are 2 more publications which have already been released officially. So the Comprehensive and Critical Dictionary of the Prakrit Languages, as you can see on the screen, volume 7th, and the quintessential Dr. G.K. Bhatt, which was released in a special program only last month. But there are some reprints also, and this is the reprint, Bharatanatyam Manjari by Dr. G.K. Bhatt, and it has got something like 477 pages altogether. Then there are two more reprints, Sayana's preface to the Rigveda Bhashya, its English translation by Peter Peterson, which was originally published in 1890, and it has got 88 pages. And a book in demand, Nyaya Siddhanta Muktavali, Marathi Anuvad, Arthabodak Tipa व न्याय व वैशेषिक दर्शनाचा इतिहास स्वरूप सिद्धांत विशद करणारी परिशिष्ट यासह. And the name of the translator is Keshav Ramrao Joshi, and it has got 340 pages. So thanks Professor Gokhale for taking the trouble to open these publications. The volumes of the annals can be had by the members of the institute as they would leave the hall after the program concludes. And now I request Professor Pradeep Gokhale to speak on Karma doctrine, some critical considerations. Thank you.
So, chairperson and my old friend Professor Bahulkar and all the assembled friends. I always use such opportunities to share my views, not to confer knowledge. So this is an important area, namely the doctrine of karma, karma siddhanta, and on that I am presenting some views. I will of course welcome your comments and criticism. So the practice which I am developing in these days is I just go on reading, and you can also watch the same on the screen. The doctrine of karma has been accepted by almost all the schools of Indian philosophy, with the notable exception of Charvaka school. Karma is a matter of popular religious belief of Hindus, Jainas and majority Buddhists. In fact, it is in some form also a matter of belief of Christians and Muslims. Whenever we talk about the fruits of our good or bad actions, determined by their moral or religious worth, and we allow the fruits to be consumed by the same person or agent even after the present life, we are accepting the doctrine of karma in some form. Karma doctrine is important from moral and religious point of view, in that it is supposed to provide a ground for the justification of morality and religiosity. One ought to act morally, or one ought to follow the rules of the given ritualistic religion, because if one doesn't, then it is held one will have to experience the painful consequences, that is fruits, according to the doctrine of karma. If on the other hand one does, one is bound to experience pleasurable consequences. The ritualist form of karma doctrine gives an assurance that if, for instance, one performs a Jyotishtoma sacrifice, then one will go to Swarga after death. It further claims that when the merit is exhausted, one will be reborn on this earth. The moral form of karma doctrine gives an assurance that if one performs a morally good or bad action, one must experience its pleasant or unpleasant fruit, if not in this life, in the next life. or next to next life. If one's birth is in a particular condition, even one's birth in a particular condition is due to actions in the previous birth. In today's talk, I am going to present some critical considerations regarding the doctrine of karma as it is accepted in some of the schools of Indian philosophy. Different schools of Indian philosophy deal with the nature and types of karma, the nature and types of the fruits of karma, and also the links between karma and its fruit in different ways. Diversity in their formulations of the doctrine of karma is due to the diversity in their metaphysical and soteriological positions. Since these schools debate with each other on their metaphysical and soteriological positions, these debates are also reflected in their formulations of the doctrine of karma. In this talk, however, I will not be concerned with details of the formulations of the karma doctrine. I will be concerned with the basic and essential features of it. Having described the basic and essential features of the doctrine, I will bring out the problematics of the doctrine of karma. I will raise here the problem of relationship of the karma doctrine with freedom. In the Western philosophical tradition, compatibility between determinism and free will is an oft-debated issue. I am raising a similar issue in relation to karma doctrine and freedom. I am suggesting that karma doctrine refers to a kind of determinism which can be called karma determinism, and it is legitimate to ask whether it is compatible with freedom. But what is freedom? The issue of freedom is complex in the context of Indian philosophy. In the context of Indian philosophy, the notion of freedom can be discussed at two levels. At one level, one can talk about freedom of a human being to choose a course of action and act accordingly. At another level, freedom in Indian philosophy refers to the state of self which is free from suffering, free from cravings, free from ignorance, and so on. We can call the first type of freedom as freedom to, and the second one as freedom from. The question of the compatibility between karma doctrine and freedom can be raised at both the levels. Hence, I will give the present talk in three parts. In the first part, I will try to understand the basic and essential features of the doctrine of karma. In the second part, I will examine the relation of karma doctrine with freedom to. In the third part, I will examine the relation of the doctrine with freedom from. So, understanding the doctrine of karma. The basic idea of the doctrine of karma is concerned with actions, their fruits, and the non-empirical connection between them. It seems that the doctrine of karma was presented in India in two different contexts. One is the context of ritualistic actions, particularly sacrificial rituals, and second is the context of the moral worth of actions and their results in terms of pleasures and pains. So, ritualistic form of karma doctrine. In Vedic culture, the Brahmana texts advocated the performance of sacrificial rituals and claimed that these rituals give their results at some later period, either in this life or after death, either in this world or in another world. This becomes possible, according to them, because the ritual, when performed, produces a power called apurva, that is, what was not there before, which continues to exist till the fruit of the action is experienced. It was believed that through sacrifices human beings try to please gods who in return give happiness and prosperity to human beings. In the framework of ritualist form of karma doctrine, goodness or badness of an action was determined by Vedic injunctions, prescriptions and prohibitions, rather than the moral sensibility. Hence, killing an animal as a part of a ritual was not regarded as sin in this framework. As against this, a moral spiritual form of karma doctrine was advocated by Shramana systems, namely Buddhism and Jainism. It was not specific to ritualistic actions or actions prescribed or prohibited by scriptures, but to all actions. Secondly, in this form of karma doctrine, goodness or badness of action was determined by its moral worth or its conduciveness or otherwise to spiritual progress, of a person. It was not determined by spiritual injunctions and prohibitions. Scriptural injunctions and prohibitions. It is possible that the moral spiritual form of karma doctrine flourished side by side with the ritualist form of karma doctrine, or it was a reaction to the ritualist form of karma doctrine. But it is sure that Shramana systems were opposed to the ritualist form of the karma doctrine. Now we can also talk about synthesis of the two karma doctrines. We also find in Upanishads and Hindu religious philosophies in general a synthesis of the two forms of karma doctrine. Upanishads, for example, criticize the ritualistic actions as leading to impermanent pleasures, but do not discard ritualism as such. In Hindu religious tradition, dharma is defined as leading to abhyudaya, that is material well-being, and nishreyasa, spiritual well-being. Hence, morally, spiritually prescribed actions lead to nishreyasa, which is a higher goal, whereas ritualist actions lead to abhyudaya, which is a comparatively lower goal. Here we are concerned with the essence of the doctrine of karma, which is common to both the formulations, ritualistic and moral spiritual. Now the essence of the doctrine. The essence of the doctrine of karma can be captured by considering what it denies rather than what it asserts. Advocates of karma doctrine often insist that two situations are unacceptable, which are called kruta pranasha prasanga, that is, that an action performed is destroyed without yielding its fruits. That is the undesirable situation called kruta pranasha prasanga, and akruta abhyagama prasanga, that one experiences something which is not the fruit of one's own action. These two are unacceptable situations. Now, by negating them, we get the the truths which form the positive essence of the doctrine. The alleged truths are: whatever a person does, the fruit of that has to be realized by the same person. And second, whatever happens to a person, it has got to be the fruit of some of the person's own actions. Now, I am going to some of the presuppositions and essential features of the doctrine. One is cosmic moral order. The above truths are stated by the adherents of the karma doctrine not as normative principles, but as objective facts. But these alleged facts are not based on any empirical data. Rather, they are a priori assumptions of the adherents of karma doctrine, which exhibit their strong belief in the cosmic moral order or natural justice. Now, an essential feature, namely distinction between effect and fruit. According to the doctrine of karma, an agent of an action bears the fruit of the action according to the moral or religious worth of the action. Here we have to distinguish between the effect, that is parinama or karya, and fruit, that is phala, of an action. Here it should be noted that every fruit is an effect, but not vice versa. We may say the logical grammar of the words such as fruit, phala, vipaka, reward, and punishment is different from that of the words effect or karya. Every action generates some immediate effects, but fruit of an action may not be immediate. It could be experienced sometime later, either in this life or in some future life. Effect of an action could be borne by a person other than the agent of the action. There is no oddity in this, but it is odd to say that fruit of an action is borne by the person other than the agent. There is oddity or surprise in saying that I am being punished for your guilt, or that you are rewarded for my meritorious act. Then another essential feature is sameness of agent and experiencer of the fruit, which also implies personal identity. The idea of personal identity in this context has two aspects: numerical identity and temporal continuity. By numerical identity, I mean that the agent of an action and the experience of its fruit should not be two different entities. And secondly, by temporal continuity, I mean the person who performs an action should continue to exist as the same person for experiencing the fruit of that action. Now, the notions of desert and responsibility. Moreover, the notion of fruit, unlike the notion of effect of an action, is immediately linked with two other notions, the notion of deserving and that of responsibility. When a claim is made that a person is getting the fruit of his or her action, it is implied that the person deserved that fruit because he or she was responsible for that action. As we have seen above, though every action generates an effect immediately, the fruit is generated generally not experienced immediately. It may be experienced at some later time, even in some other world or in some later birth. Naturally, the advocates of the doctrine of karma have to accept some link between the action and the fruit. Hence, different schools posited different link concepts which suited their respective metaphysics. Hence, the ritualist school of Purva Mimamsa has posited apurva as the link, which is the power generated by the ritualistic action. Nyaya Vaisheshika school has posited a non-empirical quality of Atman, namely Adrushta, consisting of merit and demerit, that is dharma and adharma, as the link concept. The schools such as Sankhya, Yoga and Vedanta use the link concepts such as Vasana and Samskara. Jainism posited karma as material in nature and used inflow of karma particles, that is asrava, and sticking of karma particles to jiva, that is bandha, as the link concepts. Shravakayana Buddhism posits defilements or latent defilements, klesha or anushaya, as the link concepts. Yogachara Buddhism posits the notion of alaya vijnana as the link concept. Now, I come to the implication of karma doctrine, namely the cycle of births and rebirths. The concept of just cosmic order or moral order implies that whatever pleasure or pain one experiences must be the result of one's own action. This implies that the beings born in pleasant or painful conditions must have performed appropriate good or bad actions sometime before they were born, which resulted into the present conditions. Hence, there must be previous birth. Similarly, many good or bad actions performed in this life are not seen to yield appropriate results in this life. But according to the doctrine, they must yield fruits, if not in this life, sometime later. Hence, there must be next life. In this way, next birth and previous birth, or more generally, the cycle of births is a corollary of the doctrine of karma. Now I come to part 2, problematics of the doctrine of karma, karma doctrine versus freedom 2. In the first part, I tried to give the salient features of the philosophical doctrine of karma. In this part, I will consider the problem of paradoxical relationship of the law of karma with the concept of freedom 2. Freedom 2 can be understood as freedom to act according to one's wish or freedom of choice. Now the paradox can be stated as follows. On the one hand, freedom to choose a course of action is presupposed for the operation of karma doctrine because the moral religious message of the doctrine cannot have its logical force unless freedom and responsibility of the moral agent are presupposed. This is one part of the paradox. On the other hand, some aspects of the karma doctrine underline the predetermined nature of human life and the state of bondage, the freedom from which is not possible within the framework of the karma doctrine. So first I will argue that freedom of the agent is a necessary presupposition of the operation of karma doctrine, then I will argue that the doctrine of karma implies that the agent is not free. The two arguments together will show that there is inbuilt paradox in the doctrine of karma. How freedom is presupposed by karma doctrine? We have seen that the karma doctrine is not about effect of action but about fruit of action. An action performed by one person has an effect on another person, but the word fruit is not used in the sense of effect in general. A fruit can be called an effect of an action which the agent himself bears because he deserves it. Hence the concept of desert is associated with the concept of fruit. Moreover, an agent will deserve the fruit of his action if he is responsible for it. In this way, the concept of responsibility gets associated with the concept of fruit. But one can deserve the fruit of one's own action and one can be responsible for one's action only if one has done it out of one's free will. Hence, any action to which the law of fruition of action applies must be a free action, an action done out of one's free will. So this is one side of the paradox. Now let us consider the other side. Now let us see how far on the assumption of karma doctrine the so-called free action is free. We have seen while understanding the nature of the karma doctrine that it acknowledges two unacceptable situations, that is prasangas, kruta pranasha prasanga and akruta bhyagama prasanga. Here the second type of unacceptable situation, that is prasanga, is more relevant. According to it, whatever comes to one, abhyagama, whatever happens to one, must be the result of one's own action. Now what comes to us or happens to us not only includes pleasant and unpleasant experiences we have or the situations we face, but also what we think, the kinds of decisions we make. As the famous principle goes, buddhi karma anusarini, our thought follows our past karma. Let us examine the so-called free action on this background. That we can act freely partly implies that at least sometimes we enjoy freedom while making decisions about actions. While presupposing that we are many a time free to choose among alternatives, we are considering a situation in which one is aware of different alternatives, while one is not under any compulsion to choose one alternative rather than another. Suppose A, B and C are the three alternatives before a person and the person chooses B. Then when he could have chosen A or C instead, that is, he was free to choose A or C instead, but he chose B. Now a question can be asked, why does the person particularly choose B and not either A or C? The answer cannot be just that because he was free. An answer could be because B appealed to him the most, because he liked B, or because he thought B to be the best alternative. Here the upholder of karma doctrine would say that the person liked B or B appealed to him the most, etc. is something that happened to the person. But why did it happen to that person? It must be due to his own past actions. In other words, even the so-called free choice enjoyed by a person is controlled by his past actions. Let us take a crude example. Suppose there are three food items, A sweet, B spicy and C intoxicating. Now suppose that a sattvika person will naturally choose A, a rajasa person will naturally choose B, and a tamasa person will naturally choose C. Observed externally, we can say that they have made a free choice because nobody was under compulsion to make a particular choice. They could have chosen otherwise, but they made the particular choice. But seen from the point of Sankhya psychology, one can say that the sattvika person, being what he is, could not have chosen otherwise. The rajasa person, being what he is, could not have chosen otherwise, and the tamasa person, being what he is, could not have chosen otherwise. Now the next question would be, what made the sattvika person sattvika, the rajasa person rajasa, and the tamasa one tamasa? The answer within the framework of karma doctrine would be that they are constituted like that because of their past karma. Hence, what is seemingly a free choice is the choice determined by past karma according to the upholder of karma doctrine. Such a person may not be aware that he is making the choice freely. He may not be aware that he is making the choice because of his specific temperament, that his choice is determined by his specific temperament. That is why he feels that he is making a free choice. In other words, that he feels free to choose happens due to his ignorance. In fact, our ignorance plays an important role in our experience of freedom. Suppose the agent fully knows how different conditions how different conditions, both external conditions and the internal conditions, such as his temperamental condition at that time, are going to govern his future choices, and accordingly what he is going to decide at what time. In other words, if he comes to know every active event of his future life, then the so-called choice is no more a free choice for him. The so-called alternatives are no more the real alternatives for him, because he already knows what he is going to do, what he is going to select in quotes. Such a person will lose his freedom of action. Thus, it is human ignorance due to which human freedom seems to make sense. An omniscient being, that is a being that knows what he or she is going to choose in future, cannot be a free being. God in this sense is not free. This position is deterministic, and the karma doctrine leads to this peculiar form of determinism. Now, if it is due to ignorance that we enjoy freedom, then if there are no real alternatives and if there is no real choice, then the so-called freedom of action becomes doubtful. But we started with the argument that freedom of the agent is a necessary presupposition of the operation of the karma doctrine. The two arguments together show that there is inbuilt paradox in the doctrine of karma. Now I come to part 3, problematics of the doctrine of karma. Karma doctrine versus freedom from. In the second part, we considered the problem of the paradoxical relationship of the law of karma with the concept of freedom too. In this part, we will consider the conflicting relation which the doctrine of karma has with freedom from, which can be understood as freedom from suffering, freedom from cravings, and so on. The doctrine of karma is regarded as important also because it gives an explanation of the state of bondage in which all of us are. Karma binds. Hence, the doctrine of karma is really the doctrine of karmic bondage. But there arises a question: if the doctrine of karma is so universal, and if bondage becomes a universal state, then there is no way out. No way to liberation seems to be possible. The doctrine of karma also implies that the cycle of rebirths must be beginningless. This can be proved by indirect method. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that a child is born for the first time. This is something which has happened to the newborn baby. But according to karma doctrine, the birth in a particular condition must be the fruit of some prior action of the self. And the prior action presupposes a birth prior to it. By applying the same logic, that prior birth must be preceded by a birth prior to it. Hence, we have a beginningless series of births. This implies that all the beings in the world have been in the state of bondage from beginningless time. There was no point of time when a being was without bondage. In terms of the theory of inference, this gives us what is called invariable concomitance, that is vyapti, between existence of a living being and the state of bondage. This suggests that to be in bondage is the very nature of a living being. This is one side of the picture. On the other side, generally the systems which advocate karma doctrine also advocate moksha as the ultimate goal of life. Moksha, as it is understood in the moksha-oriented schools of philosophy, refers to absolute freedom from bondage. It indicates the state in which the doctrine of karma is no more applicable. It is also a state which indicates an end of the cycle of birth and rebirth. So after achieving liberation, one is not supposed to relapse to the state of bondage. Moreover, moksha-oriented schools hold that every living being has potential to be liberated either in this life or in some future life by following a certain path. This implies that capacity to be free from karmic bondage is intrinsic to the very nature of every being. So this gives a paradoxical picture. On the one hand, all living beings are intrinsically or essentially subject to karmic bondage because the karmic bondage is beginningless. There was no point of time when the being was without bondage. On the other hand, they are intrinsically or essentially subject to the possibility of absolute emancipation. This is the claim of all moksha-centric schools. The two intrinsic natures contradict with each other. It is interesting to note how the two dispositions of the self radically contrast with each other. When the self is under the spell of the doctrine of karma, it is a state of metaphysical ignorance and bondage. A liberated self, on the other hand, is not only free from sufferings and cravings, it is free from agenthood as well. Hence, the two dispositions cannot be the essences of the self simultaneously. Universal law of karma as the essence of a being makes moksha impossible, and the possibility of eternal liberation as the essence of a being renders the application of karma doctrine impossible. In order to resolve the paradox, different moksha-oriented systems had to make adjustments either with the doctrine of karma or with the doctrine of liberation. Some restricted the scope of the doctrine of karma, whereas some diluted the concept of liberation. Let us now see how different systems of Indian philosophy had to make such adjustments. The case of the Gita. Take the case of the Gita, we can treat Bhagavad Gita as the moksha-centric philosophical text. The main problem of Arjuna was concerned with the doctrine of karma. It was concerned with the fruit of the action of fighting against relatives. And Krishna was suggesting different ways of escaping the fruit of actions. In a way, he was showing the ways of making exceptions to the doctrine of karma. The three yogas, that is jnana, karma and bhakti, can be understood as Gita's ways of making exceptions to karma doctrine. While recommending jnana yoga, Krishna says, know that you are Atman and not body. As Atman, you are not performing any actions at all. Actions may be taking place at bodily level. You are not their agent. If you fight by keeping this conviction in mind, then you will be free from the application of the doctrine of karma. While recommending karma yoga, Krishna says, if you perform an action with attachment to the required result, then the action becomes binding. That is, the doctrine of karma becomes applicable to it. But if you perform an action just as your duty without attachment to the required result, then it will not cause bondage. Hence, you will be free from the operation of the karma doctrine. While recommending bhakti yoga, Krishna says, like a devotee who offers flowers, scents and various other offerings to God, you offer your actions to God. If you perform actions with the feeling that all actions really belong to God and not to you, then the actions will no more be binding. The three popular yogas in this way can be regarded as the ways of making exception to the doctrine of karma in order to make moksha possible. The case of Sankhya. We have seen that the doctrine of karma underlies the principle that the agent of actions and experiencer of the fruits of actions should be the same. According to Sankhya, Purusha and Prakriti are the two ultimate metaphysical entities, out of which one, that is Prakriti, is the agent, and the other, that is Purusha, is the experiencer. Sankhya system in this way violates the basic presupposition of karma doctrine at metaphysical level. On the other hand, liberation is more obviously and readily available in Sankhya. Purusha in Sankhya is regarded as eternally liberated, Kevala or Mukta. But there is a problem, because karmic bondage is a matter of common experience which cannot be denied. For that, Sankhya's posit subtle body or linga which undergoes the cycle of births. The subtle body is supposed to be the product of the union of Purusha and Prakriti. Cognition and action both can be attributed to this joint product, though they cannot be applied to any one of them individually. But the union of Purusha and Prakriti is itself a result of the false identification of the two or non-discrimination between the two, that is aviveka between the two. Hence the doctrine of karma according to Sankhya rests on such a false identification. Now I come to the case of Advaita Vedanta. According to the advocates of Advaita Vedanta, there are three levels of existence, that is three sattas: illusory, that is pratibhasika, empirical, vyavaharika, and ultimate, paramarthika. The first two levels are not real because they are falsified by the levels higher than them. The ultimate level, namely the level of Brahman existence, is truly real because though it falsifies the other two levels, it is not falsified by any level. The first two levels are available under the influence of ignorance or delusion, avidya or maya. The ultimate level becomes available when the ignorance or delusion is removed. According to them, the doctrine of karma is operative at empirical level. At this level, I can identify myself as agent of actions and enjoyer of the fruits of action. But this identity of mine, which is suitable for the operation of karma doctrine, becomes available only under ignorance. When the ignorance is destroyed, my true nature will appear, according to which I am neither an agent nor an enjoyer, but I am Brahman. At that level, I will not be subject to karma doctrine. Exactly when I came under the spell of avidya and became the subject of the operation of karma doctrine cannot be determined. But though avidya and karmic bondage do not have a recognizable beginning, they can come to an end. According to Advaita Vedanta, cessation of avidya and karma is realization that they did not really exist. Hence, moksha becomes readily available in Advaita Vedanta because the doctrine of karma remains a delusion. In the case of Jainism, unlike Advaita Vedanta, Jainism, at least a dominant trend in it, holds that karmic bondage of the soul, jiva, is real. The karmic bondage is also beginningless in the true sense of the term. The soul has been accumulating karmic matter from the beginningless time. So how the soul can be free from karma becomes a problem. Though the Jainas hold that the soul is both the agent of actions and experiencer of fruits, the intrinsic nature of the soul, according to them, is consciousness. The soul becomes an agent through its association with karmic matter. The karmic matter by its nature is external to jiva. So it is possible by practicing austerities to remove the whole karmic matter from the jiva and bring jiva to its intrinsic purity. This is how Jainas find a way out from the beginningless bondage of karma. Jainas claim that although jiva's state of bondage is beginningless, the essence of jiva is not to be in bondage. The essence of jiva is its four infinities: infinite knowledge, infinite intuition, infinite energy, and infinite bliss. How do such contrasting features become simultaneously available together in jiva? Probably the answer can be found in non-absolutist approach, that is Anekanta approach of Jainism. Now, the case of Vaisheshika. According to Vaisheshikas, the self is the center of the operation of karma doctrine. That is because the self, according to them, possesses all the special qualities, Vishesha Gunas, related to agenthood, enjoyerhood, and also the link between the two. The self has consciousness of objects, due to which it has pleasure or pain. Because of pleasure or pain, it has desire or aversion, due to which the self makes an effort to achieve the pleasant or to avoid the painful. Through efforts, the self becomes the agent of actions. Goodness and badness of actions cause merit and demerit in the self, which cause pleasure and pain respectively, which are experienced by the self. In this way, the cycle from experience to action and again from action to experience has been going on from beginningless time. So cognition, pleasure, pain, desire, aversion, effort, merit and demerit, all are special qualities of the self. Now if the self has got a perfect mechanism which has kept rotating the wheel of karma and rebirth from beginningless time, where is the scope for liberation from it? Vaisheshikas try to create the scope for liberation by treating all these qualities as impermanent. They imagine the state of the self in which all its spatial qualities, including consciousness, cease to exist and call this state the state of liberation. Hence, the Vaisheshika concept of moksha becomes mostly negative and materialistic in response to the universal doctrine of karma. We can say that in order to make a strong case for the doctrine of karma, Vaisheshikas prefer to dilute the concept of moksha because the state of moksha becomes an unconscious state of self. The case of Buddhism. The case of Buddhism differs from that of other moksha-centric schools because it does not accept substantial existence and continuity of self. Hence, it cannot have identity of agent and enjoyer, which is necessary for the doctrine of karma, and it cannot talk of liberation as the eternal state of the self. In spite of this basic difficulty, Buddhists try to have both the concepts, those of karmic bondage and liberation. To justify the doctrine of karma against the thesis of impermanence and non-self, the Buddhists conceive of the nature of a person as a causal series or continuum, santana, in which both action and experience of fruit can be situated. On the other hand, Buddhists describe ultimate emancipation, parinirvana in negative terms. They do not give any positive or substantial status to it. Even the Buddha observed silence on the question about existence of the enlightened person after death. In spite of non-eternalistic and soulless approach, Buddhism has the problem of compatibility between free state of mind and karmic bondage. Here, Buddhists claim that impurities are external to mind, agantavo malaha, whereas shining nature is natural to it, prabhaswaram idam chittam prakrutya. Buddhism, this is from Pramanavartika, Buddhism in this way gives intrinsic status to liberation and extrinsic status to karmic bondage. So far I have tried to present some critical considerations regarding the doctrine of karma. In the first part, I tried to present the philosophical doctrine by focusing on its negative and positive formulation and also its essential features and implications. In the second part, I tried to juxtapose the doctrine with the concept of free will, which I termed as freedom too. I have tried to show that there is a paradoxical relation between karma doctrine and freedom. On the one hand, freedom of will is presupposed by the karma doctrine, and on the other hand, karma doctrine being deterministic makes real freedom impossible. In the third part, I tried to show how the doctrine of karma becomes problematic because of the tension between beginningless karmic bondage on the one hand and emancipation from bondage as the ultimate and universally available goal on the other. I also tried to show how different moksha-oriented systems tried to reconcile the two, either by making exceptions to karma doctrine or by describing the concept of emancipation in negative terms. The overall tone of my talk has been critical and negative. However, let me end the talk with a constructive note. Though I do not accept the doctrine of karma in its strict philosophical form, it can be appreciated in a humanized, secularized, and diluted form. Though the implications of karma doctrine to life after death or life before birth may not be accepted, it can be accepted that the actions that we perform have an impact on our psyche, which further results in making us happy or unhappy in this life itself. Hence, some core elements of karma doctrine are important from moral psychological standpoint. Secondly, on the question of causal determinism, I am inclined to accept it, though I am not inclined to accept karma determinism in its strict form. I would appreciate the existentialist insight that freedom too means absence of compulsion and not absence of causal determination. Thirdly, though I would accept neither beginningless karmic bondage nor the possibility of ultimate disembodied liberation, however, I hold that the problems of bondage and liberation should be tackled as human-centric problems within the framework of this world and this life. Human nature is complex, and both the tendency for bondage and tendency for liberation, are inbuilt in it. Lastly, the karma doctrine presupposes that there is already a just cosmic order governed by the law of karma. This, according to me, is a wishful thinking. I would say that a just social order should be our goal to be pursued rather than the fact to be believed in. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Any matters of doubt and discussion?
Thank you very much for explaining this doctrine so well. But then there is a question: do you transfer the follow of your karma? If you wish, can you transfer the follow of your karma to somebody else?
Now, according to the strict philosophical formula, it is not possible. Because then there will be this Kruta Pranasha and Akruta Abhyagama. I mean, I am following that as the essence of karma doctrine. According to that, I mean, when I transfer the fellow of my karma to someone else, that means he is experiencing fruit of what he has not done. So naturally, and I am not experiencing something as a fruit of what I have done. So in both ways there is Kruta Pranasha and Akruta. Yes, of course. I mean, they are making exceptions. So they are some basic core they are accepting, but then they are making exceptions to it, I think.
When you believe, you said you believe in Punarjanma, then he
No, I didn't say.
No, sorry. But if you for this thing, if Punarjanma is there, then there is also the second life, second person. That he's whatever actions he is doing, he is passing it on to the other. Punarjanma, he may not be same this thing. I mean,
Now, yes, but the same jiva. Sorry, there is no provision for this type of.
yes.
So now, for them, for those who believe in karma doctrine, I mean, although I am using the word person, they would say it is actually jiva which continues. Some of them would say jiva, some of them would say atman, some of them would say just it is linga sharira or sukshma sharira. Sankhyas will say that it is purusha cannot transmigrate. And what is the essence of a person? It is sukshma sharira. So sukshma sharira transmigrates. So there has to be some continuity. Buddhism has this problem of continuity. So they talk of a series. So there is serial continuity, no substantial continuity. That is what they would say.
But have you gone through the astrology part of it? Because they suggest number of things. In
Achha.
astrology also they have
Okay.
there are some conclusions.
But I mean, astrologists do not believe in rebirth.
Yeah, they believe.
Then,
Means
so
they-
I mean, what will be the answer to your question? You raised a question that he will be a different person
Yeah,
Okay,
then
the
confusion.
next person is
yeah.
a different person. So if he is a different person, there is no continuity, or there is continuity according to astrologists. I am
According to-
asking you.
According to astrology, there is continuity.
Okay, continuity of.
And they because they have got some, they give some your basic nature, character, etc.
Okay.
And in their astrology, they prove that this sort of things match to that your continuity. I mean, sorry.
Anyway.
Sir, first point, now that he's referred to the astrologers, there is a belief in the Indian tradition that an astrologer or a physician, particularly an Ayurvedic physician probably, because they intervene in the matters of karma. So an astrologer tries to tell a person some way out from what can be avoided in the future. So what I would have earned as a fruit of my karma, the astrologer tries to evade it in a way by telling me a few tricks to evade it. And so does a physician try to do it by trying to suggest to me certain remedies for my diseases. And then this is in a way, it is believed that this gets reflected in the fruits that the astrologer and the physician themselves get as a result of these actions that they have performed.
Yes.
So, isn't it a transfer of karma to a certain
So,
extent?
is it a transfer of karma or performing some new karma so that the karma, the effect of the earlier karma is nullified or whatever, or it is diluted, it is made softer like that. So, there has to be some explanation in terms of karma doctrine even there. And, generally, no Indian follower of Indian philosophy will say that karma doctrine is not applicable there. Within the framework of karma doctrine, he will try to give some explanation of that.
Sir,
So,
given-
through medicine, suppose there is karmaja vyadhi, and then one has to be free from that. So, through medicine, so taking that medicine or taking a particular treatment is a karma which will produce some fruit, and that fruit will nullify the fruit of the karma which he has performed.
One small point.
Yes.
So, given the fact that there is very little available which can be called as the karma doctrine, isn't it too much to interpret or to try to understand everything that has been given as an explanation, put forth as an explanation of the karma doctrine as an adjustment? As an adjustment, isn't it too much to interpret every explanation as an adjustment that has been made by the
Adjustment, when I say that if all these systems make adjustments, I am suggesting that they do, at least some of them, do not accept karma doctrine in the strict form. For example, in the case of Sankhya, I said that already they are accepting difference between the doer and the experiencer. In Buddhism also, basically there is a difference between doer and experiencer. So in Advaita Vedanta, they would say that it is only on the basis, at the level of avidya that karma doctrine is acceptable. Ultimately, it will be applicable to Jiva, but Jiva ultimately is Brahman. Independently, Jiva does not exist. So, and karma doctrine is not applicable to Brahman. So, all of them are in a way trying to make exception to karma doctrine. All of them. Except of course Vaisheshika, as I said, that Vaisheshika system is so tight that there is the continuation of Atman, and the same in the same Atman you have all these. There is Buddhi, Sukha, Dukkha, Ichha, Dvesha, Prayatna, Dharma, Adharma, in terms of which you can explain karma doctrine. But then, how to understand liberation if karma doctrine is so tight? Then they would say that all these are impermanent, and therefore when all of them cease, that is liberation. Because they are not able to talk of something like Atman, which is essentially blissful, or consciousness and so on and so forth, because there will be problems about dharma, adharma and so on. So there is a kind of tension between the operation of karma doctrine and the state of liberation. And how to overcome that tension, because all of them accept moksha, that is a matter of hope, that hopefully all of us will be liberated. and that hope should be kept tight. I mean, on the other hand, when you start explaining bondage, you have to accept it as beginningless. So, if it is beginningless, then it will become almost your essence. So, I mean, this is the tension. Yes.
Vipassana, in Vipassana, that Buddhist this thing, theory, they said that if you, that Patanjali also, in Dhyana, Yoga, Samadhi, etc., they said that sanskaras of birth together, they can be burnt if you properly follow their this thing, in Dhyana and all those things. You experience, I mean, that
Yes, ultimately, moksha or nirvana, whatever you accept, that is the state after which you will not be reborn. Samskaras of birth are destroyed only means that you will not be reborn. This will be your last life. And that is the kind of hope they give. But I mean, okay. But that is possible only by not accepting karma doctrine in a very strict form. And that is, the Buddhists would say that only chetana karma. It will, moksha, karma doctrine is applicable only to chetana type of karma, that is the mental aspect of karma, not physical aspect. Anyway, sorry.
Namaskar.
My question is, hello. Why is it necessary to accept in principle that there is something like liberation? The whole karma doctrine in any system is oriented towards liberation, except Charvaka. And if you take the view of Charvaka and just put aside the moksha or liberation theory, then whatever we can do only in this very life. And when you say that, then in this life it is possible to do certain action, and then that karma has effect on one's psyche. That's okay. I mean, in principle there can be some effect, but the effect is not the same. And even there is some kind of free will. We are bound by various compulsions, like our very birth, our nature, the social conditions, and so on. So although in principle there is a free will, we cannot use that free will in totality. So why to bother about all this liberation, etc., and karma doctrine? Just there is some way, you can say ethical way of life or legal way of life, moral way of life. Just try to follow that, but it is not possible for everybody to do that. Even if I want to do certain good actions, my very nature does not permit to do that. As Duryodhana has said, Kenapi devena rudhisthitena yathani yuktosmi tatha karomi. I know that the same concept occurs in Ayurvedic texts like Prajnaparadha. One who knows that what is to be done, what is right or what is wrong, but he cannot do that. Or he wants to do that, he cannot do that. So this kind of compulsions are there in this very human life. And it is necessary to overcome those compulsions and try to do certain actions to the extent possible.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. You are in a way supporting me.
Okay.
But I mean, if you mean to say that the whole talk was not necessary at all, I will agree with you also.
The result of your talk would be like that. My reaction would be like that, this is okay. It's a good talk, very good. It makes it clear that karma doctrine and liberation have no meaning.
Okay. Yes.
My question is to the creative person. I think if you take tragedy as one of the major forms of literature, as against that we have a concept of Sampurna Natak, like Shakuntar. So how would you apply the karma theory? Can any insight be had if you apply karma theory to these forms?
I mean, you can say that the tragedies can say they show how karma doctrine applies and the Sampurna Nataka shows that it is possible to overcome that and go beyond that, and some kind of ultimate, one can reach the ultimate goal somehow. So, I mean, that is what is reflected in this drama.
One question from the back. Yeah.
गीतेमध्ये 18व्या अध्यायामध्ये तुम्ही म्हटलंय की पंचैतानी महाभाव कारणानी निबोधिमे म्हणजे कर्म घडताना 5 गोष्टींची आवश्यकता आहे आणि त्यातलं एक आहे ते दैव. तर हे दैव तुम्हाला फ्रीडम देते का कर्म करायचं?
नाही, तिथे असं त्यांना म्हणायचं आहे की नाही, मला शंका आहे. म्हणजे दैवम चैवात्र पंचमम अधिष्ठानम तथा कर्ता करणंच चतुर्विधम विविधाश्च पृथक चेष्टा
दैव सर्वार्थ कारण.
दैवम चैवात्र पंचमम. सो
मग हे दैव म्हणजे काय?
दैव म्हणजे जे आपल्या हातात नाही आणि जे आपल्याला माहिती नाही. म्हणजे माझं म्हणणं की मानवी अज्ञान, मानवी अपूर्णता ही एक फार महत्त्वाची गोष्ट आहे की आपल्याला माहीत नसलेल्या अनेक गोष्टी आहेत आणि त्यामुळे आपण कितीही असलेल्या परिस्थितीवर कंट्रोल केला, परिस्थितीवर नियंत्रण मिळवायचा प्रयत्न केला आणि यश मिळवायचा प्रयत्न केला, तरी काही गोष्टी अशा राहतात की ज्याच्यामुळे आपल्याला यश न मिळू शकतं.
म्हणजे दैव याचा अर्थ नशीब आहे का?
नाही, नशीब म्हणजे याचा अर्थ काय? पुन्हा हा प्रश्न आहे ना. दैव शब्दाचा अर्थ नशीब म्हणू शकाल, पण दैव याचा अर्थ काही देवाने केलेला असा त्याचा अर्थ नाही. असला पाहिजे असं नाही. म्हणजे शेवटी तुम्ही कसं इंटरप्रिट करता प्रश्न वेगळा आहे.
नाही, म्हणजेच मागच्या सगळ्या 5 गोष्टींमध्ये तुम्हाला कर्म करायचा फ्रीडम आहे, फक्त फ्रूट जे आहे ते त्या देवावर अवलंबून आहे असा याचा अर्थ मला वाटतो.
नाही, असंही नाही ना. कर्म करायचं सुद्धा आपल्याला कितपत स्वातंत्र्य हा प्रश्न आहे ना. म्हणजे आपल्याला इच्छा आहे एखादं कर्म करायची, पण ते आपण करू शकलो नाही. तिथे सुद्धा
4 गोष्टी तुमच्याकडे
अननोन फॅक्टर्स
आढळणार.
महत्वाचा भाग आहे की अननोन फॅक्टर्स. आपण काहीही करत असताना काही फॅक्टर्स हे नेहमी अज्ञात राहतात की ज्याच्यामुळे काही वेळेला आपण इच्छा असून सुद्धा कर्म करू शकणार नाही, कर्म करून सुद्धा अपेक्षित फळ मिळेलच असं नाही. या सगळ्या ज्या शक्यता आहेत त्या काही अज्ञात कारणांनी होऊ शकतात.
हे जे अज्ञात कारण आहे ते वशिष्ठांनी जे लिहिलं योग वशिष्ठ मध्ये मागच्या जन्मातली कर्मांची फळं
असं
त्या अज्ञात असं कर्मसिद्धांत लिहिलेलं आहे.
असं कर्मसिद्धांती मानेल. कर्मसिद्धांती असं
मध्ये पण हेच लिहिलेलं आहे. योग वशिष्ठ मध्ये सुद्धा
शक्य आहे. शक्य आहे. ठीक आहे. नाही, मला काही हरकत काही नाही त्यांनी तसं म्हणायला.
नाही, पण म्हणजे
फक्त ते मी मानलं पाहिजे असं नाही. म्हणजे हे बरोबर आहे. कर्मसिद्धांत मानणारा जो माणूस आहे तो म्हणेल की ह्याला कारण काय, तर पूर्वकर्म असलं पाहिजे. मला वाटतं बरेच हात.
The discussion can go on
ठीक आहे.
too long,
Yes,
but
of course.
there are two. One is from there, and the other is from here, and then we shall stop as a formal discussion. And of course, you can discuss with the speaker later on. Yeah. नाही, तो नंतर तुमचं घेऊ ना.
Okay. Sir, as your approach to this was very deterministic, that because the law of karma is very deterministic in nature, it doesn't give any scope for free will. So what I would like to ask is, who can perform a karma? Can a tiger hunting a deer, can it be considered as karma, and will tiger have to face its repercussions? Or if we put it in more context, a disfortunate human being who can't think properly does something which is beyond his mental capacity, something that is totally normal for us, but someone who is not able to understand the complexities of the world, as per say a child or a mentally disadvantaged person does something, then can that action be considered as karma?
Yes, I mean, this is an important question. That is, when you apply karma doctrine, can we apply it to all types of karmas, whether voluntary or involuntary? And here the idea is that, I mean, according to some, I mean, for example, Jainas would say that even if I perform some himsa involuntarily, I will accumulate some papa from that. It is not necessary that it should be voluntary action. Whereas mostly many systems would say that karma doctrine is applicable only to voluntary action, that is, which is done out of free will. Now, this what we call free will, is it really free? In what sense it is free? That is a further question. But the kinds of actions that you were talking about, they are not free actions in that sense. They are made out of free will. They are out of free choice and so on and so forth. Voluntarily performed actions, and therefore, according to many systems, karma doctrine will not apply to them. But according to some, it will apply. For example, Jainism would say that even in the case of involuntary actions, karma doctrine is applicable. Okay.
But I could gather from your talk, generally, I am a layman, I am not a scholar in this, but
Please
in other words,
hold the
does
mic.
does it mean that we are all subject to a predetermined divine scheme?
No, I mean, it is not predetermined. I mean, because already somebody has decided what we are going to do and what we are going to do. It's nothing of that kind.
Actions and causes and consequences.
I mean,
it's already-
causally
it's already
determined.
there, only it becomes material when you do something. Does it mean that?
I mean, I believe that there is causal law which is operating on all of us, and so our actions are causally determined, but we don't know what are the causal factors. And when we are not under any compulsion externally, sometimes there may be some internal compulsions which we do not realize, but when we are not under any external compulsion, we have this experience that I am performing a free action, I am making a free decision. So freedom is a matter of experience, and that is possible because of our imperfection, because of our ignorance. But okay, I mean, ignorance is a bliss. So we need not complain about that. So whatever we know, on the basis of that, we should proceed. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, sir, for the enlightening address, and especially the editorial team of the Annals will always be thankful to you, because there is a practice that this anniversary address should be published in the Annals of the Institute, and after so many years we are going to get an address readily to be published in the Annals. I now request Dr. Amruta Natu to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Generally, the vote of thanks part is a kind of ritual, and it is also a moral obligation on the part of organizers. However, I am so much impressed with the lucid manner and the clarity of this lecture. On behalf of all of you, I choose to extend my gratitude towards today's speaker. Thank you, sir. There are many dignitaries, scholars present in the audience today. I extend my thankfulness to them. Thanks are also due to Dr. Vijay Bedekar and his team in Thane for live streaming of this program through internet. I thank media for the timely publicity of this event. I'm thankful to this august gathering. Thank you all. And I declare that this program is over. Thank you.
आता अगस्त ऋषीमध्ये लोकांनी जे लिहिलंय किंवा अगस्त ऋषीमध्ये नाडी ऋषीमध्ये ते अगस्त ऋषींनी